Hello and welcome to another virtual program with Maine Historical Society. I'm Kathleen Newman, the Director of Education and Public Programs. Today is December 3rd, 2020, and this is our program, A Convenient Soldier, the Black Guards of Maine, with our guest curator, Asata Radcliffe. Asata Radcliffe is a writer and a filmmaker. She received her MFA in creative writing from Antioch University. She writes fiction, speculative and science fiction, essays, and is a reviewer for Kirkus Reviews. She has writing that has appeared in anthologies and literary journals, including her most recent work in Dawnland Voices 2.0 and Luminescent Threads, Connections to Octavia Butler, the collection, released by 12th Planet Press. Asata also serves as the educational director for the 2040 Review. In 2018, she was nominated as a fellow for the first Munson Artist Residency. Asata's documentary and independent film work investigates the I'm not going to pronounce this correctly. Interstitial, am I saying that correctly, Asata? Interstitial, thank you, and society, and the abstract in her art. Her cultural film work is produced by Little Thunder Films. She is currently creating a multimedia collection of speculative and experimental installation work. And of course, she is the curator of the exhibit at Maine Historical Society, A Convenient Soldier, the Black Guards of Maine. Thank you so much, Asata, for joining us this evening.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. And it's good to talk to you because I haven't really spoken to you. I think I've seen you once or twice.
Yeah, we have our paths have crossed a couple times at Maine Historical Society, but it'll be great to have a meaningful conversation with you this evening. So can you give us a little background about this exhibit? Tell us how you came to know about the subjects of the exhibit, the Black Guards who guarded the railways and the bridges of Maine during World War II. How did you first become aware of this story?
Yeah, so you had mentioned I was nominated for the Munson Artist Residency. It was in the summer of 2018. It was the first kind of the inaugural residency. I had never been to Munson, Maine. So, you know, that was a big deal going north of Brunswick, and had some concerns about going that far north. But, you know, I think it was on the first night when the artists came together, the director offered us access to the Munson Historical Society. And I'm always intrigued about, you know, when I travel, I love to go to local archives and libraries. And so I went into the Munson Historical Society, and I wanted to learn about the indigenous people, because wherever I travel, especially being new to New England, fairly new here, I wanted to know who the indigenous people were in that region. And so it was in that search, I came across a book. It was called Onward Revisited. It was written by Bill Sawtelle, whom I haven't met yet. And in the book, it was like a collection of essays. I noticed that in Maine archives, there are a lot of local historians who have published their own history research that they've done. And a lot of times you get stories that you wouldn't read in textbooks. And so this was the story that I came across in his book of essays. And it was just a page-and-a-half story about these Black soldiers who were sent to Maine to guard the bridges and railways during World War II. They wanted to bring soldiers here, as far as I know, because there was a terrorist attempt to blow up a bridge during World War I. And this was near the border between Canada and Maine. And so I guess they didn't want to deal with a repeat of that and recruited these soldiers to come up to Maine. And at the time, the military was segregated. And so Black soldiers weren't fighting overseas. And I have not been able to get down to the National Archives because I'd like to know a little bit more about how that decision was made to send these Black soldiers so far north to guard the railways up here. So it was the Munson Historical Society that just piqued my interest. And it was just a personal story that I was connected to. It wasn't a project or anything like that.
Interesting. Can you give us a little more background on the story or the stories that are in the exhibit? There are probably some folks in our audience who haven't had a chance to visit it yet, whether online or in person. So can you just tell us a little bit what exactly is the exhibit about? What stories does it tell?
Yeah, well, the title of the exhibit is A Convenient Soldier. And when I was up in Monson, and I do give a lot of credit to the members of the Monson Historical Society, because there were a lot of elders who have been keeping that archive alive for a lot longer than I've been alive. And it was just really great that they had knowledge about these soldiers. There were a couple of people who were alive during the time, or children during the time the soldiers were there. And so I was able to get some firsthand stories from some of the Monson residents. So I didn't want to research just based on celebrating the soldiers. I was just curious as to what their experience was like here while they were here in Maine, and also looking at and meeting other people here of color in Maine, a lot of people that have moved here, and then people who've been here for a long time who are Mainers. And I just wondered, like, did they encounter, was it really great when they were here, or was it not great? And so I just wanted to know the stories. I'm always fascinated by the stories behind the story that everyone's drawn to. And I think everyone's drawn to, these Black soldiers, as soldiers that served their time, but there's a whole nother side to it. And so I began to do my own research. There wasn't hardly any information online, basically through the Maine Historical Society, North Yarmouth Historical Society. So I just started doing my own digging. And slowly but surely, just digging in the archives, I started to uncover a lot that was going on with these men in terms of the different places. And I discovered they were all over Maine. So initially I thought maybe they were just in a couple of towns, but it turns out there were hundreds of Black soldiers that filtered in and out of Maine during World War II. So that was a really great thing, to discover. And I'm sure I'm going to find more locations, as I dig into more of the archives. And as I said, a lot of this information isn't online, so you have to actually physically go and visit these places. But when I began to read about some of the racism that they were encountering, it just really, I started to think, about the whole country at that time during the 1940s, and thinking about, segregation. And a lot of these men came from towns in the South, where they were dealing with, things like lynching and the KKK. But yet and still, dealing with that kind of barbarism, they, signed up to serve their country. And then, after serving their country, having to come back to those same, conditions, and not being a full citizen, not being treated like a full citizen. And so A Convenient Soldier, the title for me, I just felt like, these soldiers were kind of used by their country to, they had these hopes of, maybe if I serve my country, I'll be treated better. People will respect my community. And that, unfortunately, took a long time for that to happen, in terms of civil rights and everything. So the story just kind of talks about the hypocrisy of how, Black people, people of color, have always, tried to invest in this country, in this American dream, and the soldiers were basically, I feel, and this is just my own interpretation, that they were just used as a convenience, as bodies to, whether it be fight in a war, or, bringing them up here to Maine to guard the railways. And in some of the towns in the exhibit, there's the town of, North Yarmouth, where the men, they guarded the Grand Trunk Bridge there. And there was a family, the Atkins family, and they had a farm, and the soldiers would come to the Atkins family house. They had to get water from the well because they lived in boxcars. They did not have housing. And so they would go off the tracks out of the boxcars to this local farm in North Yarmouth. And the family would make them pies and, just welcoming them. But that wasn't the case across the board so far of what I've found. And so I just wanted to, and this is still an unfolding project. So I wanted to tell the full story and not just Maine had Black soldiers here. I wanted to dig deeper and humanize these men and learn more about them. And that's the process that I'm still in right now.
So it's really, I mean, the exhibit itself is, it's a piece that folks can see at Maine Historical Society, and they can see it online. I just shared the link to the online exhibit in the chat. Mm-hmm. But you would say it's kind of a part of what continues to be like an ongoing research project for you, that this is something sounds like it's something you're still looking into and trying to learn more about.
Yeah, because once I started to pull together some of the stories, the main stories, what I was finding was that, for example, in Old Town, there's a lot of newspaper articles in Old Town. I think it was 1942. And there was James Coghill, who was the editor of the local newspaper there, who wrote a lot of racist editorials when the first group of soldiers arrived. And he actually went around Old Town with a petition, getting the white Mainers to sign to get these men kicked out of the town. These are soldiers that are serving your country, and they're sent here to protect you, but because they're Black, you don't want them there. And so that's just an example. And this was like in the newspapers, and a lot of those issues of that particular time period, the issues in the archives are missing. And I can tell that they're missing because when you're reading the stories, it'll reference other dates or it'll reference other issues, but then you go to the archive to find the issues, and the issues aren't there. And so what I was beginning to see was that, I'm hearing the story from one side. I'm not finding any writings or anything from the soldiers themselves. So how do I go about doing that? And so that's kind of the next phase of the project. And before March, actually in March, when we all shut down here with the pandemic, I had already planned to go down to the National Archives in St. Louis. And those archives actually have what's called morning reports. And those are daily reports of what happens with the soldiers on the ground. And those are reports that are not digitized. You have to go in person. And so I had plans on going in March, and I'm pretty sure they're still shut down. So I have to wait. But I'm hoping by getting those notes that I can, begin to paint more of a picture of who these men were individually.
Right, and from their perspective too.
Right, exactly. I want to tell the story. I want to know their story. That's the whole purpose of humanizing it. So as an artist, I felt like with this particular installation, it's kind of a speculative tale, because on the one hand, I do have, research that I gathered. But on the other hand, it's more of an envisioning of making them as human as I can until I can get behind more of their story.
Right.
So I'm hoping, by going to the archive, that will help out, and maybe even meet some of the offspring of some of these men, and maybe I could get insight there. So this is like I stumbled into something that I wasn't expecting, that was going to be a rabbit hole that can go in many directions. But definitely the pandemic slowed things down.
It slowed it down a little bit. I hope that that sounds like a really, like a lot of potential in helping to tell this story, a really good resource. So I hope that you can get there safely soon. So you mentioned these soldiers, that they were living in boxcars in the winter, which must have been pretty harsh. Do we know, and again, it sounds like we don't know a ton from their personal experience, but do we know what did they do to survive that experience? You know, in general, it sounds like you've kind of already answered part of this question. Do we know much about their feelings or their memories of it as a whole?
Yeah, so that's what we don't have documented. I actually was able to meet for the first time a few months ago one of the daughters of the soldier, and we did a Zoom call. And I won't reveal her name or anything, but just talking to her, she didn't know a lot about, you know, what he went through. Because a lot of times when these soldiers would go home to visit, you know, conditions may have been really horrible and they didn't want to bring that home to their family. But I can tell you this, one of the things that I did find, and this has to do a lot with just the process of research itself and trying to put pieces together of this puzzle. I was actually on Ancestry.com and just looking at military records, and I began to see a trend of a lot of these soldiers who were hospitalized for respiratory illnesses during the time that they were here in Maine. And so I'm thinking again about, you know, living in the boxcar. And I can say that the daughter of one of the soldiers that I spoke with, you know, she said her father did have a health concerns, but he never talked about like why he had them. And so it was this project kind of connected the dots for her, and said, oh, he was living in a boxcar. No wonder he had these health issues. And so, you know, it just took me like finding these different commonalities in the research. And so I'm piecing the story together. And again, you know, when you're looking, when things are not digitized, you have to go in person and do all this digging to find the hard copies. Because I think that's where I'm going to get a lot of the information. And again, you know, if I'm able to come across any of the family members of the soldiers.
Now, exhibit includes stories of Mainers, some these people that you've mentioned, Arthur and Edith Atkins, their family, who said they kind of embraced the soldiers as part of the community, but also stories of those like the editor that you mentioned of the Penobscot Times, John Coghill, who circulated that petition calling for the removal of the soldiers. So based on what you learned from putting together this exhibit, do you think one reaction was more common than the other? These soldiers were welcomed or they were not welcomed? Or do you think that it was kind of a mix? It just sort of depended maybe on the community that they were in and the people that they met or didn't meet?
Yeah, so just based on, you know, some of the stories that I was told when I was up in Monson, and a lot of what I have written about is based on, you know, those stories as well, the oral tradition. Now, you mentioned in North Yarmouth that the Atkins family, and you said, you know, they were embraced as part of the community, but actually they weren't. It was just that family. There's different writings. It's actually in the Maine Historical Society. Just some interviews that were done of people that were alive during that time, and they talk about how you know a lot of the families didn't want their daughters going down near the tracks where the men were. They didn't want them going near there. And I think I do remember one member of that family saying, you know, no, dad didn't want the daughters going or the sisters going down where they were. So they would have to watch from a distance. So I'm imagining, even though you had the Atkins family that, you know, were kind to the soldiers, we're looking at the 1940s. We're looking at the fact that the Klan was very active in Maine since the 20s. So I can, and then, you know, just with Old Town, what happened in Old Town, I can imagine, you know, some of the things that they encountered while they were here. I mean, that was a very different time. I mean, we're looking at racism right now in America. So I can't even begin to imagine, you know, what it was like for them to, you know, be living in such an isolated way. I did read some interviews of people that were alive during that time, also at the Maine Historical Society, people who said that the soldiers tried to keep to themselves. Like they had to go into town to get water from different wells because they obviously, you're in a boxcar, you don't have
No
water
running water.
source, right? But a lot of them had made note that the men kept to themselves, and I'm sure they were probably ordered to do that. Like, you're not here to engage with the community. But as I said, I can imagine that it was more one way that was negative than positive.
Mm.
Yeah.
How far did that petition get? Like, do we know how many people signed it, or how close did it come to being like a successful petition, I guess?
Yeah, well, he got them out of there. I don't know how many signatures were on there. As I said, there were some issues from that year that were not in the archives. They're just, gone. But that first group of men, I think there were about 50 soldiers. And again, I think that this was in 1942. I don't have the paper in front of me. But he was able to rally with people that he knew in the local government and the senators, and they were able to remove the men from the town. But another group came in after that, and so it was kind of this continual thing where we still need these soldiers to guard, like we don't have any other soldiers. But there's just a lot of missing pieces as to when exactly it happened, how many folks did sign the petition, but that first group did get removed, and that was documented in the local newspaper.
Wow.
And it's sad because they're soldiers, like they're, and yeah, so yeah.
Now, the exhibition that's at Maine Historical Society was originally planned to be photographs of the Black Guards with text, but you created an artistic installation in our narrow, like a narrow gallery space called our Showcase Gallery, a location that you specifically chose. Can you expound upon why you wanted that spot, the types of items that you added? Because it's not just photographs and text, and your inspiration for site-specific installations. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so Tilly Lasky, and I, talked about, when we originally talked about it, it was supposed to be, we talked about doing, photos and research and writing. But I just felt like, when you enter into historical societies, a lot of time, a lot of people, you're taking in a lot of history, you're reading things, you're looking at, photographs, some objects, whatever. But I just felt like I'm not that I'm not a historian, that's not what I do. And so I felt like creating this scene. So, the actual exhibit itself, we created an actual bridge in the hallway. So when I was studying the hallway, I was trying to figure out, like, what kind of, piece can I put in here that's going to make an impact. And one of the things that I did after the residency, I actually went back to Monson a month later, and for Labor Day weekend, and a couple of the members of the Monson Historical Society took me to the Onward Trestle. And the Onward Trestle is one of the tallest bridges in the country. And and this is one of the bridges that they guarded. They guarded they were on the Onward Trestle, and I felt like I need to walk on that trestle. I just want to see what it was like for them. So I did get a chance to go up there. It was very frightening. Even now they have railings. It's very windy up there, but I have a photo, which is in the exhibit, of the soldiers standing up there. It's above the treetops. That's how tall it is. And so they were standing up there without railings. I don't know how they did it. And so anyhow, when I was staring at the hallway trying to figure out what to do, I felt like, what, I want to recreate a bridge. And once a person walks into the hallway, I want people to get a sense of walking into what it was like for them. And so then you have some objects and you have photographs, and there's also a video that was produced. Two of my students from Mecca collaborated with me to create an animated piece of a script that I wrote, and we had actors and everything. So that's a part of the piece as well. But I wanted to do an installation because I feel that when people walk into the scene itself, it becomes more visceral, and I feel that trying to talk about these issues just through talks like this or just having things on the wall to read, that's just not enough, at least for me. And I just feel like if a person can be, even if it's just for a moment, in that space, um, and kind of be bombarded and destabilized with all of this information, that they'll walk away with the story and think about it, as opposed to just kind of browsing and looking and browsing and looking. So hopefully, in the future, more historical societies can think of different ways to tell these stories so that it's not just, an exhibit that's visually, visual and you're reading, but something that's more experiential.
Yeah, and I can say personally, I do think it has that effect. Like you feel it. It has a real impact physically when you walk in that hallway, and the way it's designed. It's really, I think it's really interesting and meaningful the way it's been.
Yeah, and also too in the hallway, another reason I chose it is because at the end of the hallway is the exit door, but it's a fire door, you can't leave. So
Yes.
once you get into that hallway, I purposefully crafted the story and the objects so that you have to confront like the truth of this.
You can't just breeze through it on your way to another exhibit or on your way out of the museum.
Right. Once you're in the story, once you're walking down that bridge, you're in there. And so that was another thing, because I think sometimes people might see something and say, oh, I think I'm going to go in the other direction.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
But in this one, once you go down the hall, it's very difficult to,
to not be
confronted. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. I've got a couple more questions for you, but I want to remind our folks in the audience, if you have questions for Asata, please feel free to type them into the chat or into the Q&A feature. We'd love to hear from you if you've seen the exhibit, what you think, or if you've got questions about the exhibit or about this story. One question I had just kind of off the top of my head while you were talking, is it sounds like your research has brought you into some contact with people who are descendants of these soldiers. Do we know, I don't want to get like too personal. Are there descendants of any of these soldiers still in the Maine or New England area? Or are you just kind of encountering them like all over?
Right. So the one person that I have talked to so far is not a Mainer. These men were not Mainers. Most of these men came from the South, it's like starting in New York, and then you just go south from there, or the Midwest. I haven't encountered any men that were from Maine or this far north.
But they're helping to inform you, it sounds like, in learning about this story.
Well, so far only one person so far that that reached out, and so I was able to meet her through Tilly Lasky, and then this daughter and I talked on a Zoom conversation, and I think this was after the pandemic. So we were still the exhibit wasn't up yet. We were still in the works. So I feel the more that I work on this project, and there's another phase of this project that's coming, that will, it will have, the story will have more exposure, and quite possibly, other people will reach out. Again, this is a project that has been a labor of love. I was fortunate enough to get a Maine Arts project grant for this to help me pay for it, because a lot of money came out of my own pocket. So there's so many directions that I can go with this. And right now, I'm just staying focused on finding out more of what happened when they were here and what they experienced when they were here from their perspective. So that's what I'm focused on, right? I have to stay focused on the minutia and making sure I know what that is, because I can get pulled in so many different directions because it's such a big story.
Sure. We're getting some questions from some of the folks in our audience. One question this individual is asking, in your research, were you able to find out how the boxcars were outfitted as living quarters? And they say, I asked this question because railroad maintenance crews in remote locations also often lived in boxcars.
Yeah, so a lot of what I know, which is very little in terms of the narratives that I've been reading, which aren't very many. You know, some of the interviews that are at the Maine Historical Society, and then a couple of the people that were up in Monson. One person mentioned that they may have had like the iron wood stoves in the boxcars. I don't know if that's true or not, but just for heating. But I do know that they, you know, had ways to cook their own food because they weren't cooking it, you know, in other places. But I don't know how they were outfitted. There are no photographs of how they were outfitted, but there are some photos in the exhibit of the boxcars themselves. I do know that the Army would not use the steel boxcars. And so these soldiers were given the wooden boxcars. The steel boxcars were just being made during World War II. So those were used for other, you know, the newer cars were used for other things. So the Army basically housed them in the wooden boxcars. And again, you know, you're thinking about Maine winters. And if you're in a house, you know how cold it is. So I don't know the answer to that question. However, I do have the next exhibit that I'm going to do, installation, will be in a boxcar. And so that,
wow.
and I'm hoping by the time I do that, which will be a year from now, because we had to postpone it because of pandemic. But I'm hoping that I will have more information about how to, you know, tell that story of the boxcar from my own perspective. And again, you know, I'm not a historian, so I'm looking at this from a very specific point of view right now. So there's just a lot of answers that I don't have, that I wish I did, but maybe I'll stumble upon them.
Sure. Yeah. The more you research, the more we all may learn.
Yeah.
Another question from our audience about the officers. Were there Black officers or were they white officers? I'm guessing that were like in charge of this operation or in charge of these men. And have you been able to track down like who they were and learn more about what their orders were?
Yeah. So all of the soldiers that were that I'm investigating were all Black soldiers, and they had, you know, COs or commanding officers that would come to check on them regularly, just to, I guess, see, you know, how things were going, or maybe give orders. Or so these are the things that I'm gonna find out, you know, when I get to go down to the archives. But the soldier, so and I do know that the COs that came to a couple of locations were white. You know, they weren't, you know, Black. So yeah, I'm just studying basically those soldiers. I'm not trying to track down. It's interesting because I'm not trying to track, and again, I'm not trying to track down their histories right now, the individual soldiers. I just want to get what was going on here in Maine while they were here. And I think through that, I will find out more things about them in their lives, and individually what they did back in their hometowns when they went home. Some soldiers did eventually go to fight. There was a soldier that I give honor to in the exhibit who went to go fight, and he was killed right after he left Maine. And so that's a story that's told in the exhibit as well. So it's interesting how when I focus on one thing, I find out, you know, all of these other, you know, facts. So it's gonna unfold.
Do you know how many guard soldiers there were in Maine and how many bridges they were guarding?
Yeah, so we don't know how many soldiers. Again, that's information that, man, I would have to really do a lot to track in and out, because they were in so many locations from southern Maine to northern Maine. And so far, I think I have about 9 locations that I've discovered on record. It doesn't mean that there weren't more. So I don't have the exact numbers, but I do know that in Old Town, just in Old Town alone, there were hundreds of soldiers that filtered in and out of there. And again, that was just based on reading some of the older issues of, I think it's called the Penobscot Times. And that's how I was able to. So there were a lot of Black soldiers here in Maine between 1942 and 1945.
We've got one member who's actually asking if you could use some assistance, saying, given that you can't be everywhere in Maine, especially with the pandemic, would it help you if people in the state dig into their own town archives for you? Would you welcome that kind of help?
That would be lovely. Please contact the Maine Historical Society.
Yes.
And I saw your email address before we started, and you can send your information to the Maine Historical Society, your contact info, and also there's an email, blackguardsmaine.com, and that goes directly to me. So either contact the Maine Historical Society. That would be really helpful because, as I said, once we got going with how this exhibit was going to be presented, the next phase, so this was done back in, we were ready to rock and roll with this exhibit back in March. We were getting ready because it was supposed to open in May. And so my brain was already on, okay, what's next? And so what's next was visiting more archives here in Maine as well. So if there are folks that I can, communicate with you and let you know the other locations, and then that would be great.
Yeah, I love the idea of this becoming a real community effort. As more people learn about this story, people offering to help and to do research, I think that's wonderful. Another question from the audience: aside from guarding railroad facilities in Maine, how involved were Black troops in the operation of railroad facilities across the country?
Yeah, so that's not my field. So I don't know. That's a different, that's a whole different. And I know there's a history of Black people working the railways here in New England, and I've been hearing little bits about that. But I don't personally, have that history. So my focus is just on the soldiers that served during World War II. And I think that the Saco Transportation Center is going to be doing something about the Black porters. And I think that's going to be during Black History Month in February, the Saco Transportation Center. I don't know a lot about it, but I do know that they want to do something about that side of the history of railways.
Another question, where will that boxcar exhibit you mentioned, where will that be?
Yeah, so that's another good question because I received the Space Gallery Kindling Fund for that project back in December. And of course, we're still getting this exhibit going, and the original plan was to have the boxcar at a location here in Portland. And I was in the process of meeting with folks down at the Portland City Hall, and we were trying to identify different locations that would be accessible for people to have this boxcar. And this was going on between the time I got the Kindling Fund, which was in December, and March when everything shut down. So I do have a couple of locations in mind, but a lot of it just has to do with safety, accessibility, and also I don't want to do it outside of Portland, just because everything is kind of based here in terms of the interest in the project. So I'm still trying to decide where in Portland I want it to be, but I do have locations in mind. I just don't want to disclose it yet. We're waiting for the pandemic to end or whatever. And it just may be a socially distanced, situation, but it will be an outdoor exhibit.
Very good. I have a couple more questions for you. Again, I just wanted to thank you so much. This has been a really interesting conversation. And the audience, you guys have asked some really thoughtful things as well. So thank you everyone for joining. I want to remind folks too, especially those that might be interested in sharing their own community's history, whether it's tied to this story or to another story from your town, that individuals and archives can add content to our online database, Maine Memory Network. If that's something you're interested in doing, visit that website, mainmemory.net, and you can learn more about how your local library or historical society or you as an individual can become a contributor and share your research and share your stories. So, and the other thing too, if you're interested in visiting this exhibit in person, it will be up at least through the end of December. MAS is open for limited hours and at a limited capacity to keep the collections and all of our guests and staff safe. But if you're interested in visiting, go to mainhistory.org and you can purchase timed tickets online so that you can reserve your spot and you can learn more about our hours and what we're doing to keep everybody safe in terms of pandemic protocols. So Asata, what would you the people of Maine and visitors, whether they're visiting this online or in person, to a convenience soldier, what do you want them to take away from this exhibition?
Yeah, that's a really good question because as an artist, I kind of lean into that each individual experience is their own experience, and I don't see this exhibit as being an educational project, even though it can definitely be framed that way. I think for me, this is more of telling a story that will imprint on the person that's viewing it. I want people to hopefully walk away and maybe make some connections to why we're in the situation we're in right now in 2020 as it relates to, racism in this country. When you look at how Black soldiers were treated during World War II, just that particular war. There were other wars, and not just Black soldiers, but also I have to mention, Native Americans fought during World War II, and they're not only treated like here in Maine. It wasn't just about the people in Maine who treated them a certain way, but also, their fellow soldiers who were white that treated them. And so I hope that everyone can look at this story and see, and kind of think about, how would I feel if I served my country, and I had to go home to, sundown towns, if I had to go home to, lynchings happening in my town. And being treated this way when I gave my life for my country, as I was treated as a convenient soldier, so to speak. And I also wanted to bring up, Black Lives Matter, because I think a lot of people don't understand, what that means. And, so this just goes back, this is just one story that can connect to Black Lives Matter. And just, the fact that, people of color in this country, especially Black people, Native American people, in so many ways have not been treated as, full citizens. There's this idea of freedom, and what does that mean? And I think we're, once again, as a country, revisiting that. And it always takes these horrible things happening for us to, come together and have these conversations. So when you're seeing Black Lives Matter, I'm hoping people can make a connection and say, oh, this is why, Black people are so frustrated and so upset, because we keep seeing these patterns over and over of how they are not treated as if they are full citizens of this country, and having to deal with racism in places like Maine in 2020, and basically in many instances being told you're not wanted here in Maine, go home. And I can tell you so many stories of people that I know and myself that have experienced these things. So I'm hoping that this story will highlight for the visitor how this is kind of a cyclical thing that we've been going through, and it's nothing new. And, I'm sure there are more stories than the one that I'm telling that can shed light on why we're at this moment in the 21st century.
Thank you. One last question for you, and you've touched on this a little bit already. Um, I hope that you'll keep us, you'll stay in touch and you'll let us know the new things that you're learning, the research that you're doing. It's such a fascinating history, and it's really interesting to hear what you're learning and where you're learning it, how you're doing this research. So we'd love to hear more. Do you have other projects about the Black Guards you'd like to talk about? I know you've touched on that a little bit. Um, any other projects that you're presently working on, or what's next for you?
Yeah, so we talked about the boxcar installation, and again, that's going to be, I want that to be up when it's cold, so
Yeah.
probably do that around December, January next year. I just recently had an outdoor installation at the Niles house, which is next door to the Abyssinian. It was a 2-week outdoor installation, and it was actually telling the story of Civil War soldiers, Black Civil War soldiers that lived here in Maine. So these were soldiers that
Mhm.
actually lived here. And so that installation was telling another Black soldier story. And then also I have another exhibit that's totally different that will be featured at UNE, Portland campus in February. And I'm not going to say anything more about it, but it's going to be totally different than the historical stuff. Because like I said, I'm not a historian. It's just that, living here in New England, everything is about the past. And it's hard to get away from not, encountering these subjects in your work as an artist when you live here. And I'm moving into my 6th winter here. So going on, 6 years here in Maine. So I'm hoping that, with the Black Guard project, once I do, am able to execute the Boxcar project, maybe, I don't know, maybe that will be the end of it, and maybe I'll keep going with it. But people have been coming to me asking me, you should write a book, or, you should do a film. And so there's just so much that can be done, and I can't do everything. And I do work, I teach, so this isn't like my job. So
Mhm.
there's so many great questions that people have been asking that I wish I can answer. But again, I have to remind people I'm not a historian. So I just have to make sure that I'm focused on, finding the answers that I want for myself.
Well, the exhibit is really wonderful. This was a
Thank you.
great conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. Good luck with all the work that you're doing, with the research that you're continuing to do. As I said, we'll be eager to hear more about what you're learning, and to see more of your work.
Thank you. And I just wanted to say thank you I can see the number of participants, and just really excited that everyone came out to listen. And I hope that people can get out. I'm very happy that the Maine Historical Society actually allowed this to happen, because there's so many artists whose exhibits got canceled this year. So just wanting to thank the Maine Historical Society for, allowing this to go on until December 31st. And yeah, I love to hear, feedback from the community. And you can send that feedback to the Maine Historical Society. And thank you for having this time to talk this evening. I appreciate it.
Thank you. It was our pleasure.